One. Good morning. I'd like to call to order this session of the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. Welcome my colleagues, Vice President Friedson and Council Member Katz. I almost forgot your name, sorry. Sydney.
I'm good, yeah.
I should have grabbed another coffee. All right, what are we doing today? We are set to talk about our operating budget spending affordability guidelines, like the capital budget guidelines that we took up last week and the council passed on Tuesday. The operating spending affordability guidelines are required by the county charter with specific requirements set forth in the code. Unlike the capital guidelines, which we took up last week, those are multi-year. The operating guidelines look at the upcoming fiscal year. There are 3 required components that we will take up today. And when setting the operating budget spending affordability guidelines, the code states that the council should consider the condition of the economy, the level of economic activity in the county, trends in personal income, and the impact of economic and population growth on projected revenues. It's important to know that while this process establishes key initial affordability targets, it does not restrict the council from adopting a budget in May that differs from the targets, nor does it create any restrictions for the executive's budget submission. The aggregate operating budget ceiling does create, though, a supermajority voting requirement. So if the council adopts a budget in May that exceeds the adopted aggregate operating budget ceiling, it will require 8 votes to do so. The council is required to adopt the operating budget guidelines by the 2nd Tuesday of February, so the committee's recommendations will be considered by the full council on February 14th. Before I turn it over to Mr. Howard to walk us through the packet today, I'd ask my colleagues if you have any opening remarks. Nope. All right, Mr. Howard, it's your show.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is I'll go through the different components, and first we'll talk about the condition of the economy, and we'll stop there and see if there's any comments or questions, and then go through the different decision points that the committee has to make and stop for each one for discussion and decisions. So in general, I think the chair has already described very well the process and why we're here and what we need to do. In the staff report on page 2, we did include a summary of the December fiscal plan update, just as a reminder for what was discussed then, with the key indicators being that the revenues in the out years in 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28 are projected to grow at slower rates than we had projected when the budget was approved last May. So the first section with the condition of the economy, I won't go into great detail on all the different bullet points because a lot of this has been discussed both in December and then also discussed as part of the capital affordability guidelines that you took up. But in general, while the local and national economy is showing improvements from the pandemic levels, there is still considerable uncertainty and signs of a potential recession in many of the indicators, providing reason for caution in some of the near-term forecasts. So first, we always look at the unemployment rates, and the unemployment rates did decrease year over year, both in the region and in the county, and so we are now moving closer to the pre-pandemic levels on unemployment, and 3.6% in the county as of October 2022. Across the region, the total number of jobs has nearly returned to the pre-pandemic level, and we've attached some information to the staff report from the Stephen Fuller Institute providing data there. And as would be expected, the sectors that have had the most growth from the pandemic levels are those that were most impacted by the pandemic. So you can see some of that job recovery happening. The county's resident employment has increased, but is still well below the pre-pandemic levels. The inflation rate increased significantly in 2022, which is no surprise to anyone. And while it is expected to decrease in 2023, it will remain higher than the pre-pandemic levels. And so that is one of the factors that still creates some uncertainty in the broader economy. The county's office market did experience an overall increase in vacancy rates in 2022 when looking at both Class A and Class B office space, but the changes in average rent did vary a little bit. The average rent in Class A office space did decrease slightly in the past year, while the average rent in Class B office space increased. And then, as was also discussed in December and during the capital affordability discussion, after significant increases in 2021, the county's home sales declined in 2022, and the median sales value is expected to decline in 2023. And as we've talked about, this has a big impact on our recordation and transfer tax revenues. In terms of personal income, salary and personal income did increase in 2022, but are projected to have smaller growth in 2023, and this is reflected in the reduction in income tax revenue estimates kind of going forward and in the out years. Social Security for the COLA for Social Security recipients will be very high in 2023, 8.7%, and that's a reflection of inflation. Some other kind of relevant factors that we look at each year. First, in terms of population, the county's population is expected to continue to increase at a similar rate as it has in the past, bringing total residents to about 1.1 million by the year 2026. The Federal Reserve does project some more interest rate increases in 2023, maybe not as much and at a lower rate or a lower amount, and that's the overall impact on inflation and the economy still remains uncertain there. And then the last factor is a new update since December. The Maryland Board of Revenue Estimates didn't have their December meeting, and in that meeting they decreased the state income tax revenue estimates by about $33.9 million in 23 and $178.6 million in 24 compared to the September 2022 revisions. So that's just another data point to see that may be kind of, usually it flows to the state first and then to the county later, so that may be what we will be seeing in the next couple of years. And so I'll stop at that point just to see if there's any questions, comments, discussion on the economic factors.
Great. Do my colleagues have any questions or comments? No? Would anyone from Finance or OMB like to comment at this time before we move on? No, you're good. All right, Mr. Howard, continue, please.
Perfect. Okay, so now we'll move on to the decision points, and this is starting on page 5 of the staff report. So the first decision point is the ceiling on property tax revenue. And this decision is kind of governed a little bit by the charter limit that we now have on property tax revenue, which as of the most recent amendment in November 2020 requires an affirmative vote from all council members to exceed the real property tax rate from the prior fiscal year. So ever since the charter limit was adopted, the council's general practice has been to set the ceiling on property tax revenues at the charter limit, and so that's council staff's recommendation to do that again this year, consistent with past practice.
Council Vice President Friedson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to note that we continue to call it the charter limit. I wish that we would just call it the tax rate, because the charter limit people think is the old charter limit, which was a very confusing system. I was pleased to write the new, much easier, much simpler, much better property tax system that we now have that is more like almost every other jurisdiction in the country. It's how most people think of property taxes. The rates are what they are, and you pay the ad valorem, by value rate of your assessable taxes, and then you have certain credits and other dynamics that we can use with other different tools to pursue other interests. I will note that this committee, the prior iteration of this committee, sponsored that amendment, and I just think it's important to note. But I do think it's important. I have continued to say this. When we say the charter limit, nobody knows what that means. So I understand for our purposes, it's important of what the triggers are and the voting numbers are, but I think we should just call it the tax rate, because that's essentially what it is. We used to call it the charter limit because in order to explain what the charter limit meant would take multiple pages of text, and still there was arguments of what construction was included and what construction wasn't, for instance. I just want to note that I have asked for this multiple times. I think it's important for transparency that people know what we're talking about. I don't think most people know what the charter limit is, but I also wanted to note that this is a positive. It has been a good thing. I don't think you should need a PhD in economic theory to understand what the property tax rates are, and now you don't. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much. And I agree with the Vice President. However, you're saying the property tax rate, is there a ceiling? How do we say that it's the same, it's the previous tax rate? What is the right terminology for this thing?
It's just the last year's tax rate. In order to
it
increase,
would be the same as the previous year.
Correct. According to the charter, the limit is the rate.
Yeah.
So it's the tax rate. I mean, it's one and the same. So I think we were caught up in our previous verbiage that we used to focus on, because the charter limit was a moving target that we had to back into based on finding out the total amount of revenue, adding in inflation, figuring out what construction counted and what didn't count and what worked and what didn't work, and then back in a rate from there. It was very confusing. So to make it easier, we said we'll just stick to the charter limit. But now we can just say the assumption is that we are going to maintain the tax rate at the current rate, no tax increase, and here's what that would mean based on the assessable base.
I'm good with that, yeah.
Noted, Mr. Howard?
Duly noted. We will work on updating the verbiage, and I can't speak for executive branch staff, but council staff appreciates the much less complicated calculations that need to be done.
I mean, we could call it the Howard tax rate.
No, we're good. All right, well, let's deal with what is before us. The council staff recommends setting the ceiling on real property tax revenue at the prior year's tax rate, consistent with council's practice for the past decade. Are we good with that? Oh, yeah, Mr. Covey.
Yeah, just to remind, might cover you with finance. We should say average weighted tax rate or weighted average tax rate, because it's not just the general county rate, which is one single number that doesn't change. Yeah.
Okay.
Maintain the current weighted average tax rate, property tax rate.
Okay. Great.
Perfect.
All okay with that?
Yeah.
All right. Mr. Howard, move on to number 2.
Okay, our next decision point is the ceiling on the aggregate operating budget. And the council sets this ceiling on the aggregate operating budget, or AOB, as kind of a benchmark for the upcoming FY24 budget process. The intent of the guidelines is to set an AOB that's generally affordable to county residents. It's similar to the capital guidelines. It's based on affordability and not need, and that's the reason that the code requires to look at the different economic factors. It's important to note, as the chair mentioned, that the AOB set by the council does not restrict the executive for recommending a budget that exceeds or is below the AOB threshold. If the council does want to approve a budget in May that exceeds the AOB threshold, it would require 8 affirmative votes to do so, and that's the supermajority requirement that the chair mentioned. There's also one other voting requirement, in that regardless of whether the council passes a budget that exceeds the AOB, if the council passes a budget that exceeds the previous year's AOB by rate of inflation, which is 7.16% this year, then it requires 7 votes. If neither of those factors come into play, then it's just a simple majority for the council to pass its budget in May. It's also important to note that the AOB calculation excludes a couple of different items. First, all enterprise funds are not included as part of the AOB. The WSSC water budget is not included. Tuition and tuition-related expenditures for Montgomery College is excluded, and also grants that can only be spent on a specific purpose are not included as part of the calculation. On page 6, we provide some historical data on what the council has used to determine, how it wants to set the AOB ceiling. There is not a specific element or data point that's defined in law. That's the council is required to use when setting it. It's up to first the GEO committee and then the full council to look at different variables and decide what they feel is the appropriate measure. Between FY11 and FY23, the most common factor the council has used is the increase in the estimated rate of total personal income growth. But there has been some other years where the council has decided to use other factors. There's also been years where they've decided not to increase the recommended AOB because of fiscal uncertainty. So council staff presents 5 options for the committee to consider when deciding how to set the AOB ceiling for FY24. The first, option number 1, would be to hold the FY24 ceiling at the same rate as FY23. The second option would be to increase the FY24 ceiling based on the agency allocations estimated by executive staff in the December 2022 fiscal update. So this would result in a 2.83% increase overall. The third option is to increase the FY24 ceiling by the estimated rate of inflation for 2022, which would be 7.16%. The fourth option is to increase it by the by the estimated increase in the average personal income for 2022, which is 2.16%. And the last option would be to increase it by the estimated increase in the employment cost index for state and local governments for FY22, which was about 4.6% when we put this information together. I understand there's an updated figure that's about 4.8%, but the employment cost index for state and local governments is essentially a measure of inflation for compensation costs, salary and wages for local governments. Council staff recommends establishing the ceiling based on option number 4, the increase in total personal income for FY22, with the idea that this recommended ceiling would balance the projected revenue growth with the projected potential drop in income tax revenues in FY24. And this would set the ceiling at about $5,686.2 million, and would generally align with how the council has set the rate, for most of the years in the past. And so with that, I'll stop talking and open up for discussion from the
Great.
committee.
Thank you so much. Would anyone from OMB or Finance like to comment before I open up to my colleagues? No? You're good? All right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I appreciate it. This is a really good backdrop into what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. I think it's a window into how local government works and how we structure our budget. I'll just say, for all the reasons that we already talked about related to the capital budget, which I think this is a very related conversation, we might have a similar conversation here. I'd prefer option 4. I think it's most consistent with how we have done this in the past. To me, there's not a compelling reason to do otherwise. I'll say option 2 is not that much different. $37.4 million in the scheme of a nearly $6 billion aggregate operating budget is a marginal difference, but I think the consistency piece to me is important. I would want to have a compelling reason to do it differently, but I think if we did option 4, option 2, I'd be fine. I'd prefer and think that we should go with the council staff recommendation with option 4. So with that, I'll yield back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember?
Yeah, I do, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, one, I just want to say thank you to the staff for adding option 5, the employment cost index. I'm not going to advocate for it, but I think having that number is helpful as we're making decisions and thinking about where we're going, in particular because so much of our budget is dependent on people and our personnel. So I wanted to thank staff for including that. As my colleague said, there's not much difference between option 2 and option 4, but like with the capital guidelines, I'm leaning towards option 2 here and going with the executive staff recommendation. My reasoning, and again, there's not much difference here, is given what we learned on the increase in tax revenue recently, and in addition what we discussed with the capital budget, wanting to make sure we have as much flexibility as possible on pay-go. So again, the differences aren't huge between option 2 and option 4, but I'm leaning towards option 2. Councilmember Katz?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm certainly leaning towards option 4, and I understand what you're saying about option 2. I do. And I understand that I think your number was 37.4 million difference, and in the scheme of the world for us, it's not that dramatic. But I am concerned that we still don't know where we're going to be. In the packet, they use the term uncertainty. And that's where we are, as far as I'm concerned. Depending on the day you'll listen to the pundits, but who knows what's going to happen with the inflation? Who knows what's going to happen with the housing market, other than the fact that it's going to slow? I just believe that the lesser number. We are better off with the lesser number, so I'm in favor of option 4, though I understand how you got to option 2. Thank you.
Great. So, Mr. Howard, I think the GO committee has a similar finding as we did on the Capitol, that 2 of the 3 members support the council staff recommendation of option 4, and we can just note that I favored option number 2, but that there really wasn't a great deal of disagreement between either option.
Very similar to the capital discussion. It's kind of a 1 and 1A.
Yeah, it is. It's very similar. Yeah. I think we have one other category to walk through.
So the last piece is, now that you've decided what the overall limit would be, is the operating budget allocation. And what the code requires is to allocate the AOB amongst certain non-agency uses as well as certain agencies. It's important to note that these allocations are illustrative and not final. You're not making a budget decision now. You're just providing a general allocation of where the dollars might go. There are several factors that would potentially change where the dollars end up between now and when you receive the executive's budget on March 15th. Revenue estimates obviously can change, and when we get the February distribution, as was discussed recently, that will give us a better indicator of where we are on revenues. Some of the non-agency uses and agency uses can be shifted around. Reserves, obviously we are projected to end the year at above 10%. The executive and the council could determine that they want to hold some of those dollars for future fiscal years and not spend it all. The fiscal plan assumes that the reserves are brought down to the 10% level. And then also, one of the things is agency allocations can change based on fund balance reappropriations. In the past several years, MCPS, for example, has had about $25 million in unspent funds that the council has reappropriated as part of their budget. We don't show those as part of this exercise because we have not received the board's request yet. So we don't want to assume that there's going to be fund balance available if it's not. So there are other factors that will increase the agency budgets as well. Also, there is no voting requirements, supermajority requirements triggered by how you do these allocations. What does happen, though, is if an agency submits a budget that exceeds the allocation approved by the council, they need to provide a letter by March 31st stating how they would change their budget to get down to the AOB level if needed. One thing that's important is state aid amounts are not known in January, obviously, or in February now. And so we always include a provision in the resolution saying that if an agency exceeds AOB because of increased state aid, they do not need to submit a letter for that, because obviously we want to encourage all the state aid we can get. And I'll go through each of the components of the allocations real quickly, but in general, over the past several years, the council has taken the following approach to determining allocations. To approve allocations for debt service, current revenue, funding in the capital budget, and OPEB in line with the current fiscal policies, and then approve allocations for MCPS and Montgomery College at maintenance of effort levels, with the understanding that final decisions for those agencies will be made during the budget process and may differ from the MOE amount, but this is just kind of a starter placeholder number. So consistent with that historical approach, council staff recommends the following allocations. For debt service, we recommend $446.2 million, which is the amount in the fiscal plan. For current revenue in the CIP, as everyone is very much aware, there are two different components. The first component is the current revenue that is not bond eligible for non-bond eligible uses. So that amount is $98.3 million, and council staff recommends continuing with that amount. And the second type is the PAYGO, which can be used to substitute for bonds. The council staff recommended that at $30.8 million, consistent with the December 2022 update. One small correction that I realized this morning, based on your discussions on the CIP affordability, the executive did recommend, as part of his CIP, $32.8 million, a slightly higher amount in PAYGO. So staff would recommend, since while the capital budget affordability doesn't take a position on PAYGO, there was general agreement with that amount submitted by the executive. So council staff would recommend increasing that amount to $32.8 million at a minimum. For retiree health pre-funding, the council staff recommends allocating the $62.6 million. That's consistent with the fiscal plan. And then for the agency allocations, staff recommends the MCPS and Montgomery College at maintenance of effort levels, again with the understanding that can and probably will change during the budget process depending on several other factors. And then recommends allocating the remainder to county government and MNC PPC in proportion to their fiscal FY23 allocations. And the one slight amendment would be to take $2 million out of the county government allocation and put that instead in that PAYGO piece. And all the allocation, on page 9 of the staff report, you can see how all the numbers play out for under option number 4, which is the committee's recommendation. So with that, I will stop talking and open it up for questions, comments.
Great. Any comments from finance or OMB before I open it up? You guys are good? Okay. Council Vice President Friedson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think this probably is no surprise to colleagues. I've been talking about this for quite a while now, but I think it would be prudent if we increased PAYGO here as part of the aggregate operating budget. It wouldn't tie our hands in any way. It wouldn't change the overall aggregate operating budget, so there actually wouldn't even be a vote trigger, I just want to point out. But it would send a signal to the executive branch of what we intend. It would send a signal to agencies of what ultimately we are operating within, and would allow us to fully fund or come close to fully funding some of the shortcomings and some of the gaps in the capital budget. I'll note, as I have before, fiscal year 22, the county executive proposed, the council ultimately approved, reducing $15.5 million out of PAYGO in order to take care of the operating budget at a time of significant uncertainty as we were in the depths of the pandemic. It turned out we were better off than we realized, thanks to federal support that really buttressed the economy, most importantly, and buttressed the county government as well to get us through that. I had wanted to pay that back. Ultimately, we didn't make that decision because we missed the opportunity at this point, and it's hard to undo it after we get to that point. So my recommendation is to increase PAYGO by $80 million. I think it's a prudent number based on the revenue numbers that we've talked about before, the $160 million additional resources as noted. I think this is a fiscally prudent thing to do. I think it is reflective of our priorities, and I also think that it's important to note that our operating budget has increased at a far greater pace than our capital budget has, and yet our capital needs continue to remain. And as we make fiscally responsible decisions to slowly right the ship as we have over the last 13 years now, and I think the county deserves a tremendous amount of credit. This committee and our prior chair deserve a tremendous amount of credit. Former County Executive Ike Leggett deserves a significant amount of credit for getting us to this point. That's related to how much bond issuance, how much debt we take on. It doesn't have to mean how much financial commitments we make to the capital budget. We now have the opportunity to do something that's fiscally responsible that helps us fund that capital budget, and I think it's prudent that we do it. So I'll move $80 million additional to PAYGO. That would be a total of $112.8 million for PAYGO, and I'll yield to council staff, but my thought process here would be, and executive staff, that we would maintain the educational institutions at maintenance of effort, and the county government and MNC PPC would be adjusted accordingly. We would obviously keep our fiscal plan in terms of the allocations. That's first. Second, MOE, make sure we go to maintenance of effort. And then third, we would adjust the other items accordingly.
Councilmember Katz, second. Anything from the council executive?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would just note that, you know, we do have a surplus today in income taxes, but we're still only halfway through the year as far as the budget is concerned. We haven't seen what Tax 22 means for income taxes yet. We'll see that at the end of this month. So, so I would just say, you know, we do have a significant income tax surplus at this point in time, but you may need it for other things before we get through the end of the year. So we're not going to count our chickens,
right.
if you will.
But
so,
my understanding from what, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think that's actually all the more reason why I think this is such an important recommendation, because counting our chickens would be to assume that we can spend more money in the agency's budget. So if we have this aggregate operating budget, and then it appears that we have the money that we didn't expect, that will be layered on top. And that money will be spent, or at least proposed to be spent, when it comes to the council. And then by the time we go through our process, we may be in a different position, and the flexibility that we have in that for money that's already been allocated in a recommended county executive budget is extremely difficult at that point to change. So to me, this gives us a lot more flexibility. It ensures that it's used for one-time expenses, and allows us to move forward with our other obligations. And it doesn't trigger, as was noted, it doesn't trigger a vote requirement, here. The county executive doesn't have to do this. You can always spend less than what our recommended numbers here are in the aggregate operating budget. There's no trigger for going under. There's triggers for going over. But I think it sends the right signal, and hopefully we can work together to fulfill what is our shared commitment to ensure that our schools are funded to the greatest extent that they can, that our transportation priorities are fulfilled in a manner in which we can.
Great. And we'll note, as we noted before, that as we got the information last week of the additional $160 million, this is half of the 160 million. So just to run through, we are on debt service, taking the council staff recommended debt service that should be set at $446.2 million, the amount of debt currently outstanding and estimated to be issued. On the, my glasses, council recommends setting what are we up to? The reserve funding at $98.3 million, consistent with the December 2022 update. PAYGO would increase to approximately, you could do the math later.
112.8.
Thank you. I was going to do everything together, just as a package. Is that okay? And then we had OPEB allocating $62.6 million, consistent with the December 2022, and then maintenance of effort on MCPS and Montgomery College, and as well as MNCPPC, correct?
I think one change, I think the remainder, the county government and MNCPPC would be adjusted accordingly.
Oh, right.
So we may be making no changes effectively to the council staff recommendation, consistent with the fiscal plan and our fiscal commitments in the December 2022 update. And we would adjust, essentially the agent, what we generally refer to as the agency's budgets proportionally.
Yes, and if you look on page 9 under option 4, the numbers for MNCPPC and county government would be, the total amount of that would be reduced by by $80 million, but we would adjust the amounts accordingly based on the same way we do it when we create that. So it's based on their FY23 allocation amount.
Right.
So I'll have the updated numbers for that as part of the resolution for the full council.
For Tuesday.
Yep.
All right, terrific. All right, I think we're all in agreement with that. So, good. Anything else, Mr. Howard?
That is it. You are
All
done.
right. Anything else from the executive staff? No? Well, thank you for making the trip over here. And I think that is it for our committee, and we are adjourned today. Thank you all.